Hello, my name is Stefan Seele from Coleago Consulting. I'm going to share my slides with you. Here we are. Well, first of all, thank you for joining this showcase session on the IMT identification for the 6 gigahertz band, closing the digital divide in Africa. That is my take on this, really. Now, a little word about myself and Coleago Consulting. I'm the CEO of Coleago Consulting. I worked in 10 African countries. Coleago has carried out projects, mostly spectrum related, but also other connectivity and regulatory projects in 24 African countries. Coleago is, of course, one of the foremost telecoms management consulting firms, and our core skill is in spectrum related matters. So let me start to look at the agenda for this particular showcase session. First of all, I'd like to look at what spectrum is required to realize the 5G vision, particularly in Africa. I then look at modeling area traffic demand in cities, and I explain that a little bit more detail later. And I look at the supply side, i.e. the capacity for area traffic, and I then compare demand with supply to see whether actually additional spectrum is required. And I then look and compare the IMT or 5G mobile versus Wi-Fi use of the 6 gigahertz band. And all of this with a focus on Africa. So first of all, why is 5G different? Well, it's not simply a continuation of the mobile business as we know it. Whereas 4G was essentially about people with smartphones, best effort service, 5G is so much more. Enhanced mobile broadband, fixed wireless access, and that is really important for Africa, as well as massive machine type communications and critical machine type communications. So it's a ubiquitous fiber-like user experience. That is what 5G will deliver. And you can see that 5G is different when you look at the requirements drawn up by the ITU. The user experience data rate jumps by a factor of 10 to 100 megabits in the downlink and 50 in the uplink. And the area traffic capacity, that is how much traffic can you squeeze into a particular area, that is relevant for cities, dense urban environment. And the increase in the requirement is 100-fold. And already looking at this, you can see this isn't going to work without more spectrum. Now, of course, 5G will be introduced in all the bands, in the legacy bands, sub 1 gigahertz at 700, 800, and 900, in the lower mid bands between 1.5 and 2.6 gigahertz. And African countries have started to assign the C band in 3.3 to 4.2 gigahertz. And of course, what we're looking at, do we need more spectrum in the upper mid bands? Because the other spectrum, which I've indicated here, the high bands, 26 gigahertz or higher, that is really to serve these hotspots. So that doesn't really give you, or that spectrum isn't useful to give you citywide coverage. You really, what we're looking at for citywide coverage, or speed coverage, I should say, to bring that 100 megabits user experience, you are looking at that upper mid-band spectrum. We've built a model where we look at the traffic demand in the 2025 to 2030 timeframe. So this is relevant because, of course, decisions made at WRC 23 are made with that future in mind. So the starting point is the ITU required user experience data rate. After all, we all want 5G. All governments want 5G. That's what we signed up to. So that's our starting point, that 100 megabits in the downlink and 50 megabits in the uplink. And we're using population density as a proxy. Because after all, where there are people, you've got smartphones and in future 5G smartphones, And you've got also all the other stuff, smart cities, perhaps connected cars, camera, and also perhaps FWA in some suburban areas. Of course, not everybody will be using, or not every application and user will require 100 megabits at the same time. So we made an assumption for the activity factor to represent concurrent demand from human users and concurrent demand from new use cases. So that is within the busy period within the same cell. Luckily, not all the traffic needs to be carried by base stations that are located outdoors. There will be some offload to millimeter wave sites and indoor small cells. And that gives us the traffic demand per square kilometers, which is measured in gigabits per square kilometer. Using population density as a proxy is reasonable because, as I mentioned, this is where traffic occurs. Concurrent demand is the other key factor. Concurrent demand will be going up over time as more and more people have 5G smartphone and as the other 5G applications develop. And we know from where 5G has been launched that smartphone usage trends towards fixed usage. We are now at over 1 gigabyte a day in many markets where 5G has been launched. And 5G video also means that people use higher bandwidths for longer periods. So that increases the concurrent use. Just as an example, you can see here within a single device, the iPhone 12, already if you set it to the highest quality for video, you require 60 megabits. That's for a single device, 60 megabits. And that's today. And we know that technology doesn't stand still. So that drives area traffic demand. And the capabilities or the requirements are going up and up and up. Whilst today, perhaps people only demand 6, 9, or perhaps 13 megabits for their video experience. In future, it will be much more. And as I say, quite rightly, the ITU requirement is for 100 megabits in a downlink. I talked about the offload. So depending on the city, between 10 and 40% of demand may be served by high bands, millimeter wave sites. But of course, millimeter wave sites don't provide a concurrent or a contiguous coverage. So they're not the solution. But there will also be sites indoors in shopping malls and so on, which take care of some of the traffic demand. So that looked at the demand side. I now look at the supply side. So what do we have in cities? We have macro sites, which are already in place. And even in Africa, some operators start to install small cells. They sectorize the cells. We have assumed maximum sectorization. We have assumed eventually all the existing spectrum will be refarmed to 5G and all the spectrum will be installed on all the sites. And we assume that operators will make the investment in advanced MIMO. So we maximize the spectral efficiency measured in bits per hertz. That gives us our capacity supply per square kilometer, again, also measured in gigabits per square kilometer. And you can see the assumptions we have made in terms of spectrum efficiency. Our starting point is, of course, that we do have some spectrum, or some spectrum is likely to be signed for example, in the C-band. Some or many markets in Africa are behind in that respect, but it's rolling, it's happening. We assume this spectrum will be available. And the question we are asking, after that has been done, do we still need additional spectrum? And that is what the model outputs. So this is the additional mid-band demands, and specifically, we're looking at 5925 to 6425, which is the lower portion of the 6 gigahertz band, and 6425 to 7125. And you can see here the sectorization and spectral efficiencies we have assumed. We have also assumed that mobile operators are not standing still, that they will make the investment in small cells. And we have assumed 1 or 3 small cells per macro site. So to be clear, that means that the number of sites in cities will increase by a factor of 3. So that is a massive investment that needs to be made. So we've taken that assumption that the investment will be made and then asked the question, do we still need spectrum? And so having done this, deploying hotspots, installing upper midbands on small cells, deploying all the spectrum on all the cells, that gives us, that maximizes really the area traffic capacity supply assumption. You can now compare, under that very favorable scenario for supply, we can compare demand and supply. So we compare the traffic demand per square kilometer with capacity supply. So the starting point there is looking at population density. And we've done this in Africa for 3 cities. This is Johannesburg, and you can see the high density areas. The high density area of 222 square kilometers, the population is not below 10,000 per square kilometers, and the average population density is 14,681 people per square kilometer, with a population of 3.3 million. So you can see these are these high demand areas, and 222 square kilometers, you can readily see there's no way you can cover this economically with millimeter wave, because the cell range is far too small. And this chart just simply shows you the distribution of population density within Johannesburg. We have picked, as I said, the area of 222 kilometers. There are, of course, other choices to be made. At the population density, even if you go further out, 318 square kilometers is still well above 10,000. There are many other cities in Africa where this is the case. For example, Nairobi in Kenya, in an area of 241 square kilometers, you have a density of 18,758 per square kilometer. And you might be familiar with Lagos, which is, of course, one of the African mega cities. And there you have a really, really high population density of 30,968 in an area of 215 square kilometers. That's 30,968 per square kilometer. So what we looked at is fulfilling the downlink requirement, but also the uplink requirement, because there will be more and more of that. By definition, video telephony, for example, is two-way, and also cameras are two-way. And the additional link in these sampled cities, you can see it here. It is Nairobi from 1 gigahertz to 1.8 gigahertz. The assumptions you make with regards to offloading traffic to high bands and the activity factor. Lagos slightly lower. As you know, South Africa and Nairobi are in development terms World Bank upper middle income countries. So if we expect there to be more development and hence more demand, Lagos slightly behind, and that's looking at the 2030 timeframe. But even there, because of the high population density, you need an additional 1.8 gigahertz to 2.6 gigahertz. So those are the numbers coming out of our model, and this is why it is so important that additional midband spectrum is found, or else you cannot realize the 5G vision. Looking at this, sometimes it's difficult to understand whether these numbers make sense. Now, in most cities in our sample, with a 20% activity factor, the area traffic density is less than 300 gigabits per square kilometer. And so we thought, let's compare that with the ITU requirement of 10 megabits per square meter. And what you can see, 3% of the local GDP. Our estimates are really quite modest. And if you look at peak area capacity in the really, really dense spot, all of you are familiar with the London bus. Now, I'm not suggesting you have double-decker buses in Africa, but nevertheless, you do have buses and people relying on public transport. There are a lot of people packed into that. Traffic jams everywhere are legendary. And you can see here, if only 10% of the people are using video within that bus, the area traffic demand is 6.4 megabits per square meter, which is not far off the ITU requirement of 10 megabits per square meter. And even in African countries where you don't have these very big, dense cities, if you have additional spectrum, of course, it reduces small cell investment, and that delivers environmental benefits and cost benefits. For example, the more spectrum you have and the fewer cells you need to build, the more energy efficient networks become. So it is really demand to deliver 5G with 50 megabits in the uplink and 100 megabits in the downlink. I now like to look at what additional spectrum can do outside cities, and in particular to achieve Africa's connectivity goal. As I've shown on one of the opening slides, fixed wireless access is one of the 5G use cases. Already with 4G, we started FWA, 4G FWA taking off. And with 5G, this is being turbocharged. Why? Because 5G is spectrally more efficient, more spectrum is being made available. So actually looking now at FWA and 5G with the additional spectrum, it really becomes a proposition that is comparable with fiber in terms of speed at a much lower cost. And as a result, we see that wireless technologies are indeed the fastest growing access technology globally. And this is highly relevant. There are 51 million FWA connections, or well, by the end of 2019, and that number is forecast to grow hugely. And particularly, most of the growth is really happening in emerging markets, in Africa, in Latin America, as well as in Southern Asia. Of course, in Africa, the problem is rural broadband access. And that's, in my title, I said, well, how can we close the urban-rural digital divide in Africa? Why is there this divide? Because the economics of connecting people in rural areas are so poor, even with FWA. Building fiber, even in cities, too expensive. There's very little fixed network infrastructure or wired infrastructure, I should say, in Africa. In Africa, connectivity means wireless, and that really will never be any different. But the FWA business case is highly dependent on the number of connections that can be supported by a single cell tower, because this is where the cost is. You have to build the tower and you have to connect the tower with fiber, the backhaul, and so on. So the more premises you connect from a single tower, the better the business case. And this is, of course, important because affordability is key. And the number of connections that can be supported on a single tower is a function of A, the data rate that must be delivered, and B, the amount of spectrum used at a cell tower. So this is what we put into our calculations to show what is the benefit of additional upper mid-band spectrum to solve the urban-rural digital divide in Africa. Already showed you that the spectrum is required in an urban area. We need this additional upper mid-band spectrum. Do we need it in rural areas? And the answer is, it is really very, very useful. So you can see here on the right-hand side, the chart shows you if I want to deliver 100 megabit service to households or premises, if I only have the baseline spectrum available, which I showed you earlier, which includes the C-band, I can only support 90 premises. If I've got an additional 1 gigahertz, that jumps to 315, and with 2 gigahertz to 540. So you can actually bring rural broadband connectivity without subsidies. So using 6 gigahertz for FWA in addition to other mid-bands future-proofs FWA to deliver speeds beyond 100 megabits. In fact, you can deliver 300 megabits and still have a good business case with 5G after FWA. So the economics are there, and the economics are better than fiber. As I mentioned, in developing countries or in African countries, internet access is synonymous with wireless access. In theory, fiber can be built to all locations. However, this is not economically feasible, even in advanced economies, so let alone in developing countries. So in most countries, broadband will be wireless, including mega cities such as Lagos, Cairo, Dhaka, and the 6 gigahertz spectrum has a key role to play in that. And it's really connecting the unconnected households. Most of these are, or percentage-wise, the highest percentage of unconnected households is, of course, in rural areas. So, and this is made clear by the Broadband Commission 2025 targets. And what I like about when you look at the Broadband Commission report, they focus not just on the need for connectivity, but they combine that with affordability. What's the point in building a network if it's too expensive? People can't afford it. And again, here, spectrum has a role to play because, as I showed on the earlier slide, if you have more spectrum, you can support more connections from a single tower, which brings down the cost and hence ultimately leads to more affordable broadband, FWA broadband in both suburban and rural areas. Let me give you a practical example. So this is a screenshot here from Google Earth. This is in Benin. We've taken the village of Faubourg in Benin with a population of 6,000 to 7,000. That's probably somewhere in the region of 1,500 premises or thereabouts. There is an existing cellular mast where the red dot is, and you can see the population of the premises are within 1 square kilometer, less than a square kilometer around that existing tower. So all you would need to do is to pop the additional spectrum on that tower, and all the premises in that town would have access to 100 megabits broadband, 5G FWA broadband. So that really demonstrates the cost advantage of 5G in areas like that. And this is particularly important because many regulators have set mobile coverage obligations. So then using the mobile infrastructure, the same infrastructure, mobile operator can deliver both FWA, 5G FWA, and 5G mobile. And of course, in a 5G network, there's really no distinction infrastructure-wise. These are just different services. For example, because you might use outdoor CPE and to extend the range and so on. So, because in middle and low income countries, the access network is essentially provided by mobile operators using 4G and 5G, the notion of using more spectrum for Wi-Fi to distribute traffic around buildings is pointless because the connectivity bottleneck is a connection to the network. So in countries with low FTTH penetration, the unlicensed use of mid-band spectrum allocating or identifying the entire 6 gigahertz band for IMT, the socioeconomic benefits for Africa, which would not be the case if that went to Wi-Fi. And the benefits, which I like to summarize here, are that you leverage the mobile coverage obligations, which are already there. It is scalable because you can pop the equipment or the radios on an existing sites, and regardless of where the demand within a village is located, they can pick it up. Whereas with FTTH, with fiber, you actually have to fiberize every single street to provide coverage in the entire village. And that's, of course, makes the economics worse. It's not scalable, FTTH. And it's speed to market, because the tower is already there. All you need to do is pop the spectrum on the tower, and you can launch the service. So let's compare more directly IMT 5G mobile use with unlicensed Wi-Fi use of the 6 gigahertz band. Of course, Wi-Fi is hugely important. But let's ask ourselves the question, where's the balance between giving more spectrum to Wi-Fi or 5G? Billions of devices are Wi-Fi enabled. Many more devices are Wi-Fi enabled than their mobile phones, it must be said. And there's also some outdoor use of Wi-Fi. But the coverage of outdoor Wi-Fi points is perhaps 100 meters with Wi-Fi 6, not more than that. But Wi-Fi only provides the last hop between the devices and the broadband access network. And in developed countries, such as European countries, the United States, Canada, Japan, Korea, where there is a good broadband access network using copper, fiber, or cable, Wi-Fi is present in virtually every home. And of course, fiber is being built out to 100% of the premises in many, many countries. And the usefulness of Wi-Fi essentially depends on the availability of a broadband access network. And the broadband access network using wired technologies of fiber is really very, very thin in African countries. So the notion of using 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi to distribute around buildings is pointless, because the connectivity bottleneck is in fact the connection to the network. And so the 6 gigahertz band could be used to close that bottleneck. And we're seeing already that 5G download speeds is now faster than Wi-Fi for smartphone users in 7 leading 5G countries. On this chart, you're seeing here the download speeds for Wi-Fi, 4G, and 5G. Wi-Fi was better and is better than 4G, without a doubt. But you can see the observations here from OpenSignal show clearly that actually 5G gives people better, on average, better download speeds than Wi-Fi. That's just to tell you that Wi-Fi isn't necessarily faster than 5G. In fact, the evidence shows that it's the other way around. Some people say, yeah, what about Wi-Fi offload? This is the notion that traffic is offloaded to Wi-Fi from mobile network. That's fine if you actually have lots of fiber around. But because there isn't fiber around in most African countries, what is actually happening, or the fastest growth, is Wi-Fi onload. The sales of 4G enabled routers and soon 5G enabled routers is going through the roof. And this is Wi-Fi onload. So this is where somebody, could be a business or it could be a household, is buying a 5G router, place it within their home, and from there distribute the signal around their home. But the access link is provided by 4G and now 5G. So for most of the world's countries and most of the world's population, and particularly in Africa, an IMT of the identification of the 6 gigahertz will deliver better socioeconomic benefits compared to the unlicensed Wi-Fi use of the 6 gigahertz band. So that is my key takeaway from Africa. And for enterprises, of course, reliability is important. And again, with Wi-Fi, it can't be guaranteed, whereas, of course, we all know that 5G has these features that are built in, ultra reliable, mobile broadband says it all. 5G can deliver something which Wi-Fi can't, and not least mobility. And that is where the difference is, because 5G is a mobile technology, you can move around, Wi-Fi isn't. So let me conclude. The broadband penetration in Africa, as you can see on this chart, has been essentially driven by mobile broadband. A mobile broadband, I think in the early years, people used 3G. Whether that can be referred to as broadband is questionable. I don't think so. 4G, yes, but particularly 5G is clearly a broadband technology. And you can see fixed broadband is going nowhere. Satellite broadband is marginal. So the agenda item 1.2 will consider the identification of 6425 to 7025, that's 600 megahertz for IMT in region 1, of which Africa is, of course, part, and then globally 100 megahertz in 7025 to 7125. So there's 600 plus 100, 700 megahertz in total. And of course, African countries can support this. This would be useful for Africa. And of course, depending on the region and country outside the WRC process, it may be possible to also use the lower portion of that band for 5G. In fact, this is already happening because China supports to use the entire 1.2 gigahertz band for 5G, i.e. license, and also the RCC countries, that is Russia and CIS countries, appear to favor to use the entire band for 5G. Europe had made, which is of course region 1, has made the decision to use the lower portion for Wi-Fi, or RLAN as it's called in ITU speak. And some countries have made the decision to use the entire band for Wi-Fi, and these or unlicensed use. That's US, Korea, Brazil, and so on. But I would say this: Africa needs an African solution. As you can see, the US, Korea, Brazil, Korea, every household has fiber, so it makes absolute sense to get more spectrum to Wi-Fi. But this is not the case in Africa. So what I would say, African solution for Africa, a rich world solution to countries with extensive fiber deployment. And on that note, I like to close my presentation. I'm happy to take questions. I have a few questions here, which I will try to answer. Right. I have one question here about other mid-band frequency being used for FWA. Can that not provide the capacity? And the answer to that, of course, if you look at the C-band 3.3 to 4.2, this is an important component of that, but there's other stuff going on there. Not all of this is available. There are coexistence issues. So this is why the 6 gigahertz band is so important. But even there are coexistence issues, satellite fixed links and so on. Studies are underway. It all looks encouraging. But as you saw, for the need, the spectrum need in cities is such that the solution to the spectrum need cannot be provided in a single band. I have a further question here. What do you see as the balance in the 6 gigahertz for Wi-Fi and IMT? How much benefits for each? Well, as I said, in the band, there's 1.2 gigahertz available. I think if you look at the northern half of region 1, i.e. Europe, the balance is probably 500 megahertz for Wi-Fi, i.e. unlicensed, and the remainder for IMT. Looking at Africa, it makes more sense to use the entire 1.2 gigahertz for IMT, as it does indeed in other emerging markets, such as Southern Asian countries or some of the Latin American countries. Let me just see whether I have another question. I have one from Graham McDonald from Apple. Most of the higher bandwidth applications and services will be indoors rather than outdoors, which suggests there's a better justification for license exempt Wi-Fi access at 6 gigahertz and not high power IMT. The justification for 6 gigahertz for IMT seems irrational, considering all the existing bands. Well, as we have seen, actually, when you consider the traffic density, you do need the additional spectrum. And whilst I completely agree with the point that the use is indoors, the problem is that you do not have a wired or fixed network, i.e. fiber to the premises in Africa. You simply don't have that. So what are you connecting to? So you really need the 5G or that spectrum in 6 gigahertz for the access network. So the situation in, let's say, a Benin or a Nigeria is very different. Lagos is very different from Chicago or New York. So that is why the Americans have gone down a different path, or the Koreans have gone down a different path, because the situation is different. So it's not a one-size solution for the entire world. And as we saw, other regions and countries are minded to make other choices, including China, that's in excess of 1 billion people, and of course the RCC countries, Russia, CIS, and so forth. And it would appear that many African countries are minded, for the reasons I just outlined, to support an IMT identification in the 6 gigahertz band. So there are no further questions for now, but oh yes, there's another one. Cameroon. Yes, this is about Cameroon making a mess of the fiber policy and fiber rollout. So yes, I mean that is one of the issues. It is difficult, of course. Bringing fiber to rural is immensely difficult, and this is where I said the spectrum would be very useful for 5G FWA. Now there is a report on spectrum need has been launched by the GSMA. That report was written by Coleago. You can download it from the GSMA website. And tomorrow there's a GSMA showcase session. I also have a small slot in this showcase session. And this is really for the launch of the report. You can look at that. You can download the report. There is much, much more information available also on the detail of the demand and supply modeling. So please don't hesitate to download the report. It's a free publication. Go to the GSMA website and you'll find it there. And please join the GSMA showcase session tomorrow. So with that, thank you very much. I'll leave it at that. And I believe you're all going for lunch now. Thanks for joining. And one thing, no, don't if you have any question, don't hesitate, please, to send me an email. I'll try to respond. And of course, you can download this presentation, as always, from the organizer's website. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.